For the past 3 years, the entire artificial intelligence industry has been held hostage by one company, one man, and one tiny piece of silicon that costs more than a brand new Ferrari, and nobody seemed to have any way out. Governments were panicking, startups were dying. Even Microsoft, Google, and Meta were begging for chips they couldn't get, paying absurd prices for GPUs that were being rationed like wartime bread. However, buried in a quiet research paper published by Microsoft, a small team of engineers may have just detonated a bomb underneath the entire $4 trillion GPU empire. It's called Bitnet. And if what the researchers are claiming turns out to be true, the GPU crisis, the one that's been choking the world economy, inflating Nvidia into the most valuable company on Earth, and putting AI behind a paywall only billionaires can afford, might be about to end. So, buckle up, because the story of how 3 engineers with a whiteboard might have just ended the most profitable shortage in tech history is going to be a wild ride. Before we get into it, here's what you're about to find out. First, how one 1980s research concept that everyone ignored for 40 years suddenly became the most important idea in AI. Second, why Nvidia's entire business model depends on something Bitnet makes completely unnecessary. Third, how a model running on a regular CPU, the kind of chip in the laptop you're watching this on, just matched models that required $240,000 of GPU hardware to run. And finally, the reason big tech might actually try to bury this technology, because the truth is, if Bitnet works at scale, the companies who hoarded GPUs just bought themselves the most expensive paperweights in human history. Of course, to understand why this is insane, you first need to understand how ridiculous the GPU crisis actually got. Let me take you back to late 2022, when a little chatbot called ChatGPT launched and accidentally broke the world. Within 2 months, it had 100 million users. Every CEO on Earth had decided AI was the future, and suddenly every single company needed the one specific chip that could train these massive models. Nvidia's H100 GPU. There was just one problem. Nvidia could only make so many of them. In fact, the waitlist got so insane that by 2023, the lead time for an H100 had stretched to 52 weeks, and the black market price hit over $40,000 per card. Elon Musk said, "Getting GPUs was harder than getting drugs." Sam Altman literally flew around the world, begging sovereign wealth funds to help him build chip factories. Saudi Arabia and the UAE started stockpiling GPUs like they were stockpiling oil. Meanwhile, Nvidia's stock did something no major company had ever done. It went up nearly 1,000% in 18 months, making it briefly the most valuable company on planet Earth. Jensen Huang, the CIO, went from being a relatively unknown tech guy to a rock star who gets asked to sign body parts at tech conferences. And the reason all of this was happening came down to one very specific, very boring technical fact. However, this fact is what Bitnet just obliterated. The Microsoft team asked a simple question. What if, instead of storing every weight as a super precise decimal, you forced every single weight to be one of just 3 numbers, -1, 0, or +1? That's it. 3 options, no decimals, no precision. Just -1, 0, or +1. Every expert in the field would have told you this was insane. You can't run a 100 billion parameter language model using 3-value math and expect it to work. You'd lose so much precision the model would turn into gibberish. It was laughable. Except, turns out it wasn't. Because when Microsoft actually built this thing, they called it Bitnet B 1.58 and tested it against a standard model of the same size. The Bitnet version matched the full precision model's performance. On reasoning, on language tasks, on math problems, on everything. And then it gets worse for Nvidia. Because Bitnet didn't just match the regular model, Bitnet ran faster. Bitnet used a fraction of the memory. And most devastatingly, Bitnet didn't need a GPU to run at all. In October 2024, Microsoft released an open-source version called Bitnet.cpp, and developers around the world started testing it. A 100 billion parameter model, the kind of model that would normally require 8 H100 GPUs, costing around $240,000 to run, was running on a single standard CPU, not a specialized chip, a CPU. The same kind of processor in the laptop you probably own right now. It was generating text at 5 to 7 tokens per second, roughly the speed of human reading. It was using 85% less energy, and the hardware it ran on cost less than $500. Let that sink in. A technology that costs $500 to run was matching a technology that costs $240,000 to run. The ratio of cost savings was literally 480 to 1. However, before you start celebrating the death of NVIDIA, there's a part of this story that is genuinely uncomfortable. Because the idea behind Bitnet? It isn't new. In fact, the core concept was first proposed in a research paper back in the 1980s, and the reason it took 40 years to become usable reveals something pretty dark about how the AI industry actually works. Researchers had theorized about low-bit neural networks for decades: binary networks, ternary networks, quantized networks. The math worked on paper. But every time someone tried to build one, they hit the same wall. It worked for tiny models but completely broke down at large scale. So the entire industry just accepted that high-precision GPUs were the only path forward, and NVIDIA, of course, made sure the industry kept believing that. NVIDIA spent billions building a software ecosystem called CUDA that only works on NVIDIA chips. They funded research labs, sponsored university programs, and made sure every AI engineer on Earth was trained to think in GPU-first terms. In other words, the GPU wasn't just the best tool for AI. The entire AI industry had been shaped around the GPU because the company selling GPUs was the one shaping the industry. And then a small team in Microsoft's Asia research division cracked the problem NVIDIA had spent a decade hoping no one would solve. They figured out that if you train a ternary model from scratch, instead of trying to compress a normal model down, it actually scales. The bigger it gets, the better it gets. Which means everything NVIDIA told the world about why you need their chips was, at best, incomplete. At worst, it was a $3 trillion misdirection, and the market is starting to notice. In January 2025, when the Chinese startup DeepSeek released a model that used similar efficiency tricks, NVIDIA's stock dropped 17% in a single day, wiping out $600 billion of value, the largest single-day loss in stock market history. Microsoft started cancelling data center leases. Meta announced it was exploring custom chips. The panic had officially begun. So what happens if Bitnet is real? What does a world without the GPU bottleneck actually look like? The truth is, it looks radically different from the one we live in now. Right now, every time you talk to ChatGPT, your words are sent to a massive data center, processed by GPUs owned by OpenAI, and sent back to you. OpenAI sees everything. So does Google. So does whoever else is running the model. Your private conversations, your medical questions, your business plans, all of it flows through someone else's computer. However, if Bitnet-style models can run locally on your phone, your laptop, your smart home, the cloud becomes optional. AI becomes private. AI becomes free. And AI becomes something you own, not something you rent. It would mean that a student in Kenya with a $200 laptop has access to the same intelligence as a hedge fund manager in Manhattan. It would mean that the $1 trillion of GPU infrastructure big tech has been frantically building might end up being the most expensive stranded asset in history. And of all the consequences, the most insane one is this. It would shift the balance of AI power away from the handful of companies who could afford GPUs and redistribute it to literally anyone with a computer. There is, of course, a catch. Bitnet is still early. The biggest Bitnet models released so far are around 2 billion parameters. Impressive, but not yet at the scale of GPT-4 or Claude. Training these models is still difficult, and nobody knows for certain whether the approach will hold up at frontier scale. But the proof of concept is there. The math works, the code is open source, and hundreds of research labs around the world are now racing to scale it up. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Why would this technology, the one that could end the GPU crisis, be something big tech might actually try to bury? Well, the answer is simple. NVIDIA has a $3 trillion reason to slow this down. Microsoft, who published the paper, has spent $80 billion on GPU data centers. OpenAI's entire valuation depends on the assumption that only they can afford to train frontier models. If Bitnet scales, all of those moats disappear overnight. Every competitive advantage built on GPU access becomes worthless. The most valuable company on Earth becomes a supplier of obsolete hardware, and the AI industry, which has been concentrating power into fewer and fewer hands, suddenly gets ripped wide open. The GPU crisis was never really about chips. It was about control. It was about a handful of companies deciding who got to build the future and at what price. And now, a three-value number system, -1, 0, +1, might just end the most profitable shortage in tech history. Whether Bitnet ends up changing everything or becomes another promising idea that quietly disappears because too many powerful people needed it to fail, is a story that's still being written. But make no mistake, the race has started, the paper is public, the code is open, and for the first time since ChatGPT launched, the future of AI is no longer locked inside a $40,000 piece of silicon. So what do you think? Is Bitnet the beginning of the end for NVIDIA's empire, or is this just hype that will fade like every other AI revolution?